This presentation is offered as a companion piece to the textbook materials on the 17th century and also to the materials on John Milton, both in the textbook and on the content page. Again, it is a bit longer than most of the others, but I hope in reviewing this material you gain a sense of the upheavals and changes going on within this most turbulent century in English history, particularly within the middle decades when the world seemed, in the words of historian Christopher Hill, like it was turned upside down. I cover here a series of key events and developments, each of which has prompted multiple book-length studies. So think of this material as a series of broad strokes, and the goal of the presentation as a whole is to introduce ideas and events that you might engage with more fully and more deeply in future projects. As always, you're encouraged to pause and do some Googling on your own if you feel any of these matters is significant enough to investigate more. Here's a quick summary of key changes going on within the time period. Again, think of this list as a series of broad strokes. To begin, the medieval feudal system, where land rights were determined by custom and tradition, was giving way to new systems where boundaries were legally established and where there was interest in making lands more productive in economic terms. Following that lead, early industrialists sought to improve production practices, and early social advocates asserted more forcefully the rights of individual people beyond their class standing. The behavior of royalty, particularly in the unfortunate case of King Charles I, was held up for scrutiny and criticism, and his tyrannical habits prompted a rebellion of a sort unthinkable in previous centuries. His execution in 1649 only exacerbated existing tensions until the ascension of strongman Oliver Cromwell, who emerged as the Lord Protector until his own death in 1658 marked the end of the interregnum, or period between kings, and began the steps towards the Restoration, where Charles II assumed the kingship and restored the power of monarchy. The changing trends in land use deserves particular attention, as it was connected intimately with the century's larger upheavals. Common lands, informally public lands accessible to peasants and nobles alike, were reclaimed as private holdings by estate holders, and forest tracts, previously managed loosely and regarded as the implied property of estate holders, were reclaimed by the Crown of Charles I to facilitate timber sales and to enable the development of the Royal Navy. Coal from the north of England was transported to the deforested south to fuel urban industries, and swampy fens in coastal areas were drained in an effort to make them more productive agricultural spaces. Collectively, these changes had the effect of displacing the rural peasantry, who in turn gradually relocated to urban centers. Long considered to be developments associated with the Industrial Revolution, these trends actually began in earlier decades and brought with them the associated conflicts and tensions. The middle decades also deserve attention for the great interest in social and practical innovation facilitated by visionaries and forward-thinking tradesmen. The so-called Hartlieb Circle, a group of reformers and proto-scientists, exchanged insights on how to improve agricultural yields and estate management, and also how to improve education and the advancement of knowledge. Rooted in the informal network of thinkers established by the reformer Samuel Hartlieb as much as the visionary Francis Bacon, the Royal Society formed in the early 1660s and sought to formalize the pursuit of knowledge. Keep in mind that the universities, the sites where we today consider these developments to happen, were hotbeds of religious conservatism and were more engaged with theology than science. The science of husbandry, or the idea of practical estate management, was influenced by the millenarian habit of envisioning a restored Eden realized in well-managed and productive landscapes. Many influential thinkers were heavily invested in this vision of a recovered Eden, and the idea figured heavily in land use reforms. Finally, the quote-unquote Industrial Revolution, a stage of history often associated with Thomas Newcomen's development of the steam engine in 1712, was actually underway in the previous century as tradesmen and merchants recognized their power within a growing proto-capitalist state. With these developments in economic and social mobility, we also see emerging trends in social activism and are justified in seeing in some of these the first breaths of modern democracy. Again, many of these figures and developments have been the focus of book-length studies. Some awareness, however, of Gerard Winstanley, founder of groups called the Levelers and the Diggers, and also a related branch of levelers who influenced Cromwell's military operations, would be appropriate. A look at your textbook's explanation of these and other related developments would be fruitful. Likewise, a recognition of the proto-democratic beliefs of the Ranters and the apocalyptic visions of the fifth monarchist would also be useful. The latter group, who read the New Testament scripture into contemporary events, found their aspirations for the apocalypse and the coming rapture confirmed in the Great London Fire of 1666. Finally, the Royalists, those from the higher social orders, retained their loyalty to king and crown, believing in natural hierarchies which kept the social orders intact despite these new tensions and turbulent developments. It remains to cover some key historical developments so that you are familiar with their names and significance. As the main legislative body positioned to check the crown, Parliament first opposed and then rose up against the cash-poor Charles I's overreaching land policies and taxation efforts. The Long Parliament, over 3 successive iterations, eventually fostered the emergence of Cromwell and facilitated the formation of the rebel New Model Army, which proved much more determined in their cause than Charles's royalist forces. The Rump Parliament, formed in a putsch, or attempted overthrow of established government in 1648, also called Pride's Purge, provided the legal basis for Charles I's trial for treason and later enabled his execution in 1649. The experience of seeing their king executed rattled many English, who were still invested in the idea that the king ruled by divine right. Finally, the bare-bones Parliament, established with the accession of Cromwell in 1653, enabled the formation of deliberative councils to move its revolutionary agenda forward. John Milton, then invested with the optimism of revolution, labored for the Council of State, where he wrote and translated treaties and other documents, indirectly shaping trade and navigational policy. With Charles I's ongoing conflicts with an increasingly rebellious Parliament, military tensions also escalated conjointly. Here are some of the key battles of the English Civil Wars, which actually proceeded over 3 identifiable stages. The battles at Marston Moor in 1644 and Naseby in 1645 are seen as the most decisive efforts of the Roundheads, or parliamentarian army, in their quest to overcome Charles I's Cavaliers. Later, as 1649 approached, Charles I's Royalists, having sought refuge in northern England and also in Ireland and on the continent, continued to engage with Cromwell's New Model Army. Likewise, popular revolts, mostly unsuccessful, nevertheless signaled the awareness of commoners to their new autonomy, with the suppression of Winstanley's diggers at St. George's Hill in 1649 as the most decisive of these skirmishes. Finally, the suppression of expatriate royalists in Ireland and Scotland and the defeats of the exiled Charles II proceeded into Cromwell's Commonwealth. Again, these are broad strokes. Each of these developments can merit further study for those interested in the key moments of this ongoing period of political tensions that informed Milton's composing of Paradise Lost. It is best to think of the English Revolution as a failed experiment in democracy. The democratic aspirations of the Commonwealth and its hopes for a fuller realization of human liberty and agency soon confronted the political realities of maintaining power in that perpetually turbulent climate. The Commonwealth soon evolved, quote-unquote, into the Protectorate, a kind of dictatorship modeled on royal motifs and led by Cromwell, the Lord Protector. Like many unstable governments, the greatest challenge lay in the succession or transfer of power to new leadership. Cromwell's unexpected passing in 1658 left a power void in which his designated heir apparent, his son Richard, was unable to fill effectively. Unsuited to the harsh requirements of leadership, Richard quietly abdicated his position, earning him the unflattering nickname Tumbledown Dick, which he is still identified by today. These events paved the way for the restoration, or the re-establishment of the royal line in the ascension of Charles II, who was able to rule the war-weary nation until his passing in 1685. The tensions would continue into the later decades of the 17th century, but for our purposes it is appropriate to stop here. Thanks for bearing with me, and I hope you've enjoyed this superficial survey of the key developments in this most fascinating period in English history.